Welcome to today's special edition of World Brief on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, where we take a look at MLK's global influence. Now, in an interview last year, the editor of Dr. King's papers and the founder of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, Claiborne Carson, reflected on the Dream speech and said, "As I've learned more about King's dream, I realize that it's global rather than simply about the United States. It's about human rights rather than just about civil rights. It's a movement that doesn't have a beginning or an end." He's talking about realizing the ideal of universal human rights. Have we got there? Well, today we're looking at the reach that MLK had and continues to have outside of the United States. And joining me now to discuss, we have Dr. Benjamin Chavez, Jr., civil rights leader and the former CEO of the NAACP. Rabal al-Assad, the founder and director of the Organization for Democracy and Freedom in Syria. Nirupama Rao, the former Indian ambassador to the United States and former Indian Foreign Secretary. And we also have Robert V. Taylor, the president of the Desmond Tutu Peace Foundation and author of A New Way to Be Human. So thank you all so much for being here today. In Syria, you know, Democratic strategist James Carville hit back at the time. He hit back at Tavis Smiley last year when he evoked MLK, saying that King would have been dismayed at the moves towards war and that Obama was, quote, dishonoring King. But Carville responded and he said, quote, "I think that we'll frame our response this way. We're not intervening in Syria, we're punishing Assad because Assad is the one that actually did this, and this is a horrible thing to gas young people. Let's just put that right out." I don't think Dr. King would have approved of that at all. Ben, I want to get your take on that. You know, in terms of, Martin Luther King, and he did preach non-violence, but then, you know, he was influenced by philosophers, particularly Reinhold Niebuhr's philosophies. You know, given that, do you think that how do you think MLK would have approached the Syrian conflict?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very important question. And I worked with Dr. King when I was very young, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King was opposed to war. He would not have supported military intervention into Syria or military intervention in any country. But Dr. King said, peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. One of the reasons why you have the conflict in Syria is because of injustice, economic injustice, social injustice, ethnic injustice, religious injustice. Until that is solved, you will not have peace.
And given the idea of sort of, moving towards, moving away from social injustice, I should say, and to some sort of peace, Robert, I want to bring you in here because obviously the existent kind of template for that, I suppose, is South Africa. I mean, we saw the country go from a situation of apartheid to a post-apartheid kind of nation. How important is MLK's legacy and influence in South Africa today, and certainly in a post-Mandela context?
Well, it's great to be part of this conversation today. I think that Dr. King's legacy invites into the South African context, as it does into our own, the question of who we want to be as both individuals and who we choose to actually be as a society. And I think that one of the most significant things about Dr. King is not that he was just this iconic leader, because, when we think of iconic leaders, we tend to bubble wrap them and put them on a shelf. And in fact, his leadership was rooted in this notion of creating a beloved community. And so he wasn't just building a movement, but he was about the question of what it means to be human, about what it means to be part of the human family and the human community. And he himself was shaped by ordinary people in that movement, people like the Rosa Parks of this world. And so there was this remarkable sense of give and take in his own involvement, in his own leadership, and in the witness and legacy that he leaves behind. And I think in the post-Mandela South Africa, that question of how to create a sense of beloved community is a really vital one. It was something that certainly the Mandelas and the Tutus of South Africa understood the need for in a very urgent and pressing way.
Hey, and this idea of community, I'm really kind of curious because I know that MLK attempted to go to South Africa, but he was denied. In 1966, he applied for a visa after accepting invitations to speak to university students, but the apartheid government actually refused to give him one. I'm kind of curious to know whether or not that was widely known by people in South Africa at the time. Did they sort of have an awareness of MLK kind of responding to the plight that they were going through and attempting to come and speak to them directly, but he was unable to?
Well, I hate to admit this, but I was a kid at that time, and so I don't actually have a memory of that. I remember learning about it in the 70s when I was involved in the student anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And I know that for many of us in the 70s, particularly following the massacres of school children in Soweto by the South African government and its police and military forces, that Dr. King was an inspiring figure, and he was inspiring precisely because he reminded us that what seemed to be absolutely impossible in the US could in fact be changed by the creation of a beloved community and a movement that brought together seemingly disparate voices working for shared goals and for a sense of the well-being of all. And so we were very aware in the 70s that invitation had not come to pass in the 60s. And of course, he was seen as a threat to the South African government, who wanted to control the images and the news about what was happening in the rest of the world as they desperately tried to cling to power. But I think what we learned from not only Dr. King, but people like Desmond Tutu and the wisdom of Mandela that we learned about, even though he was imprisoned, was that acts of love ultimately overcome acts of hatred. And that forgiveness is not just a solitary act, but in the words of Dr. King, is a constant choice about a way of life. And that was inspiring.
Robert, I have to say as well, you're sort of mentioning some of the people that touched MLK, and also that, MLK touched, and we mentioned Gandhi, we've talked about Mandela. In terms of leaders today, how would you say that King has influenced leaders today? I mean, we certainly know about President Obama in the United States. He frequently references King. But in terms of globally, are there any other leaders today, I'm thinking perhaps of, Jacob Zuma, that King has had a direct influence on?
I believe that there are people throughout the world who will readily talk about the way in which Dr. King has influenced their lives and our lives. I am hard-pressed to identify right now people who rise to the sort of stature of Gandhi and Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King. I think we certainly see young people through social media using that medium, knowing that it can be used to speak out against gender violence, or the Girls Not Brides campaign, or the struggles over women's leadership and the right for girls to be educated. And we see some wonderful emerging examples among young people. And so for me, the hope is that there is this new generation who are using technology to help shape and mold the world after the ideals of the beloved community.
I think that's it's a really important point as well. This idea of social media, and certainly being able to spread the messages that MLK spoke of. And I think that in terms of being able to spread those around, I think it's an extremely valid point to bring up. So thank you for that. Teachings when we approach conflicts like the Middle East, and just bearing in mind that teaching of non-violence in particular, I'm sure would help us all. But I have to leave it there for the moment. Dr. Benjamin Chavez Jr., Rabal Al-Assad, Robert V. Taylor, and Nirupama Rao, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.